Hello, everybody. Welcome back. It's just me and you guys this time. Don't have any guests. Before we start, and I would really love to hear from you guys, questions, students first, after I'm going to speak a little bit and offer some notes on the food movement and what happened last week with Prop 37. One of the few bits of bad news last week. But before I do, there's someone named Katie who wants to make a 20-second announcement. Katie?
Right here.
Come on up.
Hi, I am going to talk to you really quickly about an event this Thursday at the Place for Sustainable Living. Thank you. And I'm going to read a brief description of the event. It's a community forum on food justice. So the description is, Fat Beats Produce, Occupy the Farm, and Movement Generation are co-hosting the forum titled Land, Food, Power. It is the second community forum initiated by folks working to protect the Gill Tract, a historic farm owned by the University of California that is in danger of being paved over for a shopping and housing complex. This forum on Thursday features a panel of food justice activists whose collective experience reaches back to the 1960s and deep into East Oakland today. Panelists include Naomi Starkman of People's Grocery, Mona Trevino of Roots, and Melvin Dixon, who ran the food program for the Black Panthers. After the panel, there will be a discussion to find ways to support each other and leverage our collective capacity. So I left some flyers in this area where it looks like people are turning in assignments, and I hope to see you there. Thank you. Oh, 64th Street, Oakland, Thursday the 15th from 6:30 to 9:30.
Thank you, Katie. Naomi, will you just stand up so people can see you? Naomi Starkman is here. She is one of the smartest people on food politics in the country. She had some direct involvement with the Prop 37 campaign, but she's worked on many, many other issues, and she is the founder of Civil Eats, which is the best food blog out there. So anyway, I urge you to come tomorrow at 6 o'clock, 166 Barrows. And again, if you have an attendance deficit of some kind, and there are people in this room I know who do, you can remedy it by coming. She'll be taking attendance or passing around a sign-up sheet. So I urge you to come and ask all sorts of questions that don't get answered today, because she actually knows more about the internal politics of this than I do. And maybe she'll be indiscreet. Attendance question. Get out your clickers. So one of the things that's happened in this class is you've met a bunch of farmers. And last week you met a bunch of chefs. And some people were coming to office hours thinking, God, I thought I wanted to be an X. And then I saw Joel and I thought, maybe I want to be a farmer. And some people said, maybe I want to be a cook. So thinking just in terms of fantasy, which of those two fantasies most appeal to you, having met some farmers and some cooks? A, I entertain a fantasy of becoming a farmer. B, I entertain a fantasy of becoming a cook. C, none of the above. Oh, D can be both. Okay, so hit your clickers, and I'll tell you a little later. Allie will tell me. So A was farmer, B was cook, C was neither, and D was both. We could have some other entrants like policymaker, but I thought we were going to be in the realm of fantasy. Okay. Nothing wrong with that fantasy, by the way. So what I want to do today, and the reason I scheduled this class without guests at this point in the semester, is try to draw together some of the threads, use the food movement, the rise of the food movement as an organizing principle, and then talk a little bit about this election we had on last Tuesday, Prop 37, the initiative to require labeling of genetically modified food that went down by about 53 to 47, by about 500 to 600,000 votes. But before I get into the nuts and bolts of that, I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of a food movement. What does that mean? And you've read a couple pieces on it, one by me and one by this guy, Keith Kluwer, very critical of me and very critical of the movement and its philosophy. I guess the first point I want to make, I want to talk a little bit about history first, is that it's very important to understand that this movement is very young, that it really wasn't around 10 years ago. I mean, there were people doing work on these issues. There were food justice activists, and there were hunger activists, and there were animal rights activists. But the sense of a collective movement, of that these different threads coalescing, was not really present. So when you compare it to the environmental movement that it's often compared to, it's important to understand how old that movement is in America, and that you go back to Teddy Roosevelt and the movement to save the national parks. By the way, that was a Republican movement at the beginning. And in fact, Republicans have made the biggest achievements in environmental legislation. But it took a long time. I mean, it was 75 years ago at least, and you know, it's not till 1970 or so that you get the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and Earth Day. And the food movement really hasn't had its Earth Day yet. May never, but it certainly hasn't had it yet. I think there were people, myself among them, who thought that an affirmative vote on Prop 37 would have been something like that and would have represented a coming of age or introduction to the national stage of this movement. But it didn't happen yet. And it's also important to remember how invisible this issue was in America until very recently. I mean, food really wasn't on people's political, social, even economic radar for a long time. And the reason for that is important, I think, to understand. Food disappeared as an issue in the 1970s. And that's when, because of a couple policies actually pioneered by President Nixon, I alluded to them in the introductory lecture, food got really cheap. And food was removed as a political issue. In the history of civilization, food is political when there's not enough of it, right? The French Revolution is a great example. And most political leaders, all they want to do with food is have it be cheap and disappear from politics, okay? When food is very prominent, it's usually a bad sign. The Arab Spring, food prices played a very important role. And in the 70s, they were playing a very important role in America, and very threatening to the Nixon administration. So our politicians have been working to keep the issue invisible, very much in their interest, and by the way, in the interest of other people, that you don't have to worry about food prices. So what brought food to its current level of visibility? And it's sort of stunning how visible it now is, how many people think about it, how much ink it gets in the media. Well, I think a couple things happened. And these things contributed to the rise of the food movement. Food safety, I think, was a really important driver. In 1986, you had mad cow disease discovered in England. And that was one of those teachable moments, as many disasters often are. You suddenly had people learning how we produce meat in England, and they were doing the same thing here, which is to say, feeding cows to cows. Nobody knew that. Nobody really knew much about how industrial meat production worked, but suddenly the curtain parted, people saw it, and they were fearful and disgusted by what they saw. We had a series of other food safety problems, Jack in the Box, I think in 1993, where several kids were sickened and died because of E. coli in the meat, and we began learning about how these burgers were prepared and what E. coli 0157H7 was, which was historically new. It wasn't even found anywhere till the mid-'80s, and is very much a result of putting animals on feedlots, crowded confinement situations. A series of other food safety problems. Alar in 1990. This was a It's often called the Alar scare, which is a little unfair to it because there really was something a little scary happening, but there was a chemical being used on apples. And this was used to ripen them, to get them all to ripen at the same time. And it was, according to the EPA, a carcinogen, and it was very common on apples. And it got some attention, a 60-minute story. Meryl Streep got very involved. And you had this, people just abandon apples when this happened. I mean, this is before many of your time. And the headline of Newsweek was, "Panic for Organic." And this is one of the big pushes forward for organic agriculture, was this Alar scare. And it's important to realize that very often people have moved toward organic and sustainable agriculture out of fear of industrial agriculture, food safety fears. This is a strength of the movement, and I think a weakness, too, that comes up in the Prop 37 thing. I mean, to what extent do you want to build your politics on fear? But the fact of the matter is that problems with the industrial food system have driven people to local meat, to organic, to farmers markets even. So that's an important thread. Now, there was a brief efflorescence of a food movement in the 70s. And I always take pains to mention this because it's very important to understand that the people talking about it now in this last decade didn't come up with these ideas. Okay? And those of you, how many people saw Wendell Berry? Okay. Well, we talked about this at that event when he was at Zellerbach. And beginning in the early 70s, Wendell Berry, Francis Moore Lepay with Diet for a Small Planet, and someone much less well-known, but also very important, Joan Dye Gussow, were writing about a lot of the issues that people like me write about, and Eric Schlosser, and Tom Philpott, and all the people writing about these issues. They were connecting the dots between the environmental crisis and the food crisis, and the health crisis. Although we used the word crisis, and back then, the environmental crisis, we would give a lot if we could trade in our environmental crisis for that one, because there was no climate change then, or certainly no awareness of it. And the obesity epidemic hadn't started. But you still had this handful of visionary writers, and I urge you to read all their work. Barry Commoner is another one, who was linking energy use to food and looking at the fossil fuel impact of our food choices. So there was the beginning of something in the 70s, even at a time of, when the government was making food cheap. But it goes away in the 80s. Reagan's elected, and that whole conversation, which was taking place sort of on the fringes, although Francis Moore Lepay's book was a huge bestseller in '71. And she was basically showing us the environmental impacts of cattle agriculture and as an equity issue, that these cattle were consuming the world's grain and there were people who were hungry at the same time. So there is a lineage to this, and you could even take it further back. I mean, Berry came to prominence talking about Sir Albert Howard, who was a visionary, really the beginning of organic agriculture in the 30s and 40s. He was an English agronomist who went to India and studied peasant agricultural practices and compost making. And he was really a big influence on Berry. So there are threads that are going through it. But the 80s, it kind of falls silent, and then starts coming back in the 90s. I think Eric Schlosser's book in 2001, very, very important for putting this issue in front of people. And that's really a founding document. I have to say, though, as a writer, I tend to look at history and see writers as responsible for everything that happens. And obviously that isn't true. There are people doing political work. There were people doing really interesting work in Congress. In 1990, the organic law was passed. Pat Leahy, senator from Vermont, pushes that. His staffer who writes it is Kathleen Merrigan, who is now the Deputy Secretary of Agriculture. So there are people working in other arenas. But basically, something that occupies so little of our time, and we can buy with such a small percentage of our income. Remember, we spend less than 10% per person of our income on food, is not going to have a lot of political visibility. And considered in the long sweep of history, that's not such a bad thing. But as we've learned in this class, cheap food has very high price, right? It has a very high environmental price. It has a very high health price. It was almost, it was too much of a good thing, cheap food. It was achieved how? With monocultures. That's been a real theme of this course. That monocultures get you into trouble, whether you're raising animals or plants. Because when you grow too much of the same thing, especially in close confinement, you've created an incubator for diseases, for insects. Requires an enormous amount of pesticides to confront that, or pharmaceuticals. And oversupply, too, another function of cheap food, right? And this policy success of the 70s drove prices down, made meat really cheap, consumption goes up, also made junk food really cheap. Because what were we having oversupplies of? Corn and soy, building blocks of junk food. The corn becomes the high fructose corn syrup and some cooking oil, and the soy becomes most of the cooking oil in which all the fast food is fried. And both of them become the feed for the cheap meat. So by driving down the price of corn and soy for all those years, we made the least healthy calories in the supermarket really, really cheap. And that was, I think, an important point that Kelly Brownell made. But we were learning how unsustainable monocultures are. In many ways, some of them unexpected. In Claire Kremen's class, I thought she was, that was something nobody thought about. That these giant monocultures, whether of corn or almonds, was devastating for honeybees and how dependent we are on honeybees. So this cheap food monoculture economy, basically, we began learning the costs of it. And food safety was one of them. E. coli 0157, in a way, is a symptom of monocultures of cattle, crammed together on feedlots. So this movement begins to come together in the early years of the last decade. But is it really a movement? The weird thing about the food movement, and many movements splinter over time. The food movement started out splintered. Just listen to this list of all the different threads, and I bet I missed some. But I was just kind of doing it from memory. There are people working on school lunch reform, animal rights and animal welfare, GMOs, organics, people concerned about public health and food, people concerned about marketing to kids, nutrition labeling, farm bill reform, which we had a panel on in the class, food sovereignty, that's the movement to grant local control over food systems to people in different countries and different regions. And that's a relatively new thread to the movement. Local food economies, farmland preservation. That's a very early part of the food movement. Food access and food justice. Gardens and cooking classes in schools, the edible schoolyard idea. Farm worker rights, restaurant worker rights, which we'll be talking about in next week's class, restaurant workers' rights in particular. Feedlot pollution, all the environmental problems tied to animal agriculture. And soda, the whole public health problem of soda and the effort to tax soda, another losing battle from last week that we should talk about. So it's a big, lumpy tent. And not everybody is on the same page. Even though everyone can agree at a very broad level of generality that the food system is unsustainable, I think you could get everybody to sign on to that. After that, it gets a little messy. And let me give you a couple examples. Small farmers, food safety is a big issue, right? People want to improve food safety. Well, small farmers really don't like any increase in the powers of the FDA or the USDA. Joel Salatin, everything I want to do is illegal, right? I mean, he bristles at the idea of improving food safety. Whoever you're going to do it. I mean, he really believes everybody should be able to eat whatever they want. And that might work in the context of a small farm in his community, but how does that work with McDonald's? And so there's tension between small farms and food safety activists. Another tension is between the hunger lobby, as it's called, people working on food aid to the poor, food stamps, and sustainable agriculture people. And because they feel that people are pushing to make sustainable agriculture available, but that's more expensive. And the whole issue should just be getting people calories of any kind. And another division is on the idea of a soda tax. I'm sorry, about that soda should not be included in food stamps. You get a lot of public health people who will tell you that it's crazy that our food stamp money is going to support the purchase of soda and candy. But you will have hunger activists saying, why should there be a double standard if the poor want, it's paternalistic, you shouldn't be telling people what they can eat. That's a big point of tension. And people working on farm bill reform often run into that problem. Some of these tensions are philosophical, but some of them are structural. And I think it's important to understand that, as in so much in journalism, follow the money, that all these different threads of the food movement have different funding sources. Many of them in the nonprofit world. There are a lot of big food funders. But if you're competing for this funding from this handful of corporations, you need to distinguish yourself. You are more likely to get money working on your own, developing a high profile for your issue, than collaborating. And as much as these foundations like to get their groups together to collaborate, the real political inertia is against collaboration. You do better as a nonprofit by having your own brand, your own specialty, and so you can distinguish yourself and raise a lot more money. I think that that's a structural problem with the food movement that needs to be addressed, and I don't know exactly how you address it. There is some coming together, some interesting coming together. People concerned with animal rights once upon a time would have been like all over Joel Salatin for killing as many animals as he does in a given week. But there is, I think, a recognition amongst the animal rights community that these small farms represent enormous progress over the alternative, and that you find some people very concerned with animal welfare, if not necessarily rights, supporting the small farming movement. Even Peter Singer, who's one of the great thinkers, philosophers of animal rights, or he actually wouldn't say rights, he would say animal liberation. He basically supports the idea of a good farm, a farm where animals get to live out their creaturely characters and then have one bad day. He recognizes that as a significant improvement over factory farming. So you do find some bridge building going on, and there needs to be more. There's also a lot of conflict within things like organic. We now have a corporate organic movement. Big companies like Stonyfield Farm and Nature's Path, I mean big, they're not big compared to others, that are important players in the politics around organics and Prop 37. But there are also kind of scrappier grassroots organic activists that are fighting with those people, and they bicker a lot, and they bickered a lot over Prop 37. So there are tensions there too. To some extent, this is just politics, right? These things are not unusual. Troy Duster, who spoke in this class last year, has a great line about this. He's a sociologist on campus. He said this is the all-important rule of social movements. No movement is as coherent and integrated as it seems from afar, and no movement is as incoherent and fractured as it seems from up close. And I think that that's about right. So we have to strive for a middle distance. What do we see in the middle distance? Well, as I said, we see a lot of different groups doing really good, important work, agreeing on a few basic principles having to do with the fact that industrial agriculture is unsustainable in the precise sense that it's courting a breakdown of some kind. Where the breakdown will come, I don't think you could get agreement, but I think that they agree on the fact that there will be some breakdown. So that's kind of the overall landscape. Now I want to turn to Washington a little bit and say a word or two about the Obamas and their place in this. Back in the 2008 election, Obama said a couple things that gave a lot of hope to the food movement. One was, he said at a rural summit in Iowa, this was caught on tape, that he thought we should label genetically modified food because people should know, folks should know what they're eating. He never said it again, which makes me think that somebody told him, don't ever say that again. But I don't know actually what happened. It was conspicuous in his refusal to say that again. At other times, though, right when he was elected, he said, I think we should take a look at soda taxes to deal with this problem, in an interview in GQ or Rolling Stone. He also said something else interesting in October of 2008. He was interviewed in Time magazine, and I'm going to read you this quote because it's kind of striking. He said, "Our entire agricultural system is built on cheap oil. As a consequence, our agriculture sector actually is contributing more greenhouse gases than our transportation sector. And in the meantime, it's creating monocultures that are vulnerable to national security threats and are now vulnerable to sky-high food prices or crashes in food prices, huge swings in commodity prices." It's remarkably ungrammatical, this quote. "And are partly responsible for the explosion in our healthcare costs because they're contributing to type 2 diabetes, stroke, and heart disease, obesity, all the things that are driving this huge explosion in healthcare costs." It's kind of striking, isn't it? I mean, that, you know, here you have the president-to-be connecting the dots, as we've been trying to do in this class, between the environmental crisis and monoculture, between the healthcare crisis and monoculture, between both of them and fossil fuel prices. It suggests that the president gets it. And that made people very, very hopeful. On balance, they've been disappointed, I think, in what Obama himself has done and the limited amount of political capital he has been willing to spend on issues of interest to the food movement. There are some good things, and we should recognize them. In the USDA, the Know Your Food, Know Your Farmer program that Kathleen Merrigan has pioneered has actually done a very good job of consolidating many, many different programs in the USDA and using them to support the growth of farmers markets, which have ballooned under Obama, first administration, and also various farm-to-school programs, farm-to-hospital programs, and basically done a lot to seed the rise of these new economies, new food economies. And she's done it in a very clever way, with no appropriation that Republicans can kill, because she's taken, like, very cleverly from little pots of money all over the USDA. You should go on the website, Know Your Food, Know Your Farmer, or Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food. It's very interesting and has various tools you can use to find local food in your area. This is a very progressive thing. Kathleen Merrigan is a really important figure in this movement. And if Obama now wanted to signal some willingness to move on these issues, he would promote her to Secretary of Agriculture when Vilsack leaves. He's the current USDA head, and he's talking about moving back to Iowa. And if that happens, that'll be news. And we'll see. But there's a lot of people in the industry who would lie down in front of that train before it got too far. But some other good things. Food Safety Modernization Act. Joel Salatin would disagree, but this is a new piece of legislation that gives the FDA the power they need to recall food, which they don't have now, believe it or not. You know, the government can recall a defective toy, a defective car, but a food that is poisoning people and killing people, they do not now have the power to recall. Now the FDA does in the case of, not meat, in the case of produce, fresh produce. And some other things that I think are important to giving them the authority they need to inspect more food coming in from other countries, which is very, very little of it ever gets inspected. And there's a carve-out in that bill, and this, I think, was a direct concession to the food movement for small farms, for farms like Joel Salatin's, that they don't have to play by the same very expensive rules. So that's a good thing, I think. School lunch reform, Michelle Obama has pioneered that. They've improved the nutritional standards in lunch. It's been a little controversial among the kids, but that's kind of to be expected. And they've really gotten the soda machines out of the schools, and a little bit more money for more fruit in the schools. So that's a plus. And the FDA did crack down under Obama on some really deceptive marketing that was going on. There were amazing health claims in 2008 that, you know, if you ate this cereal, it would keep you from getting bird flu. No, it didn't say that. It said would improve your immune function when everybody was freaked out about bird flu. And also that these cereals would improve your kids' focus at school. They got rid of all that, and that was a good thing. And the health claims on cereal have definitely been toned down. So there are probably some more good things I'm forgetting, but those are the ones that came to mind this morning. And Michelle Obama, she did more than he did. She really took an interest. This wasn't their plan, that Michelle's issue would be food. She came in thinking she was going to do military families. I think it's really interesting she switched. And if I want to be charitable, I imagine a conversation such as, you know, they're talking about food issues, or someone's talking to them about food issues, and Barack is saying, you know, I don't think this issue is ripe yet. I don't think this movement is ripe yet. I don't think there's enough support to take on this giant industry, food industry. And he turns to his wife and said, well, maybe you should start talking about this. And that is a way to build support for change, raise consciousness about the links between food and health. I don't know if that's happened, but if that happened. But if it did, it would explain how they've been handling this issue. She's been doing a lot of interesting work. It was a lot more interesting at the beginning. First thing she did, organic garden at the White House. They called it an organic garden. You don't see the word organic anymore in that garden. It's just a garden. And I haven't read her book. She wrote a kid's book about the garden. I'm willing to bet anyone in this room $50 that the word organic does not appear in that book. But just to give you an idea of how strong she started out in her talking about food, she visited farmers markets, she had the garden, she then went before the grocery manufacturers of America, and they had come to her and said, we want to help with your childhood obesity campaign. And here's a couple quotes. What I think she did was she shifted the conversation that the industry likes to have, which is all about personal responsibility, and giving the public what they want. This is what they always retreat before, to a frank discussion of the way the industry influences our choices. Here's what she said to the GMA. We need you not just to tweak around the edges, but to entirely rethink the products that you're offering, the information you provide about the products, and how you market those products to children. And she said, and just cutting off that line about the public's, you know, eats what they want. The industry doesn't just respond to people's natural inclinations. It also helps to shape them through marketing and food science. Okay? That was quite a challenge for a first lady to lay before the food industry. Well, the industry kind of freaked out. In 2010, the industry starts fighting back after being kind of passive for a while. Very big public relations campaign against the food movement. The Farm Bureau goes after so-called food activists. I found in my own work that when I was appearing on college campuses, there were protesters that were being bussed in very often, and often farmers that had been recruited by the Farm Bureau. The atmosphere really changed a lot. After Michelle Obama, you know, announced this organic gardening, there's an organization in Washington called the Crop Life Association, which is the pesticide makers. Euphemism is very, very important in food. And the pesticide makers wrote her a letter saying that she was impugning their products by making this garden organic, and she really should use some of their products in her garden, even if she didn't have a pest problem, you know. And now, a more gallant husband would have stood up to those guys and said, don't talk to my wife that way. But Obama did something else. He gave someone at the Crop Life Association a really big job as trade representative on agriculture. So there was a real effort to, I think, dial back the criticism of the food industry. And you found that the rhetoric changes quite a bit. Remember, 2010 is when Obama's getting hit for not being business friendly enough. And there was a real overture to business. And at that point, a lot of the gas goes out of the effort to speak truth to the food industry. And they, you know, they did back off. And Michelle Obama got drawn into a very different conversation about these public-private partnerships to improve food, like Walmart, reduce sodium content, reduce sugar content. And we can argue about whether those are really worthwhile. I mean, first we have to see if the companies actually come through and do what they promise to do. But there's a real issue, and Kelly addressed this a little bit, and Marion Nestle writes this a lot, about tweaking processed food, whether it really makes a difference. What often happens when we tweak foods, we just eat more of them because it now has a health claim. And we have the low-fat campaign of the 80s and 90s as a great example. All the food got re-engineered to be low-fat or no-fat, and people binged on carbohydrates because they felt if one snack well was so good for you, a whole box was even better. And so industry likes to reformulate processed food because they can then put health claims on it. So I don't know how we'll look back on these public-private partnerships, but I'm kind of skeptical they're going to achieve very much. Now, on a parallel track, all this time, there's been this other movement, this soft political movement, as I call it in that piece, which is people voting with their forks for different kinds of food, people going to farmers markets, people joining CSAs, people getting involved in food policy councils in their towns, people basically recreating a culture of food. And that's not trivial. I don't think it's trivial at all. And that movement did take heart, I think, with what Michelle Obama did in her garden. The question is, and it's gotten kind of big. I mean, the organic industry is now $26 billion. The local food industry, this is people producing for local sale, whether to farmers markets or local institution, is somewhere between $5 and $7 billion. This is becoming significant. And we know that not every dollar of taxes is being paid on local food. So it's probably bigger than that. So this growth is important because this growth creates, I think, political power eventually. You get a handful of companies who actually have the dough to go up against, say, Monsanto and their allies. And this soft politics is raising the profile of the issue. It's a form of practice, I think, for people, and I'll talk more about that at the end. And it does raise consciousness. But is this adequate? Is it adequate to work on building these alternative food economies? Well, I think when Shelley Pingree was here, I thought she had a really eloquent answer to that. And she basically said, no, you need both kinds of politics. Because the soft politics will tend to benefit people who can afford better food. And unless you change policy, you're not going to reach everybody. So I think these things have to work on two tracks. So now I want to turn to Prop 37, okay? And I don't know how much I should tell you about the technology, and I'll go a little sketchy on it. And if you want to ask me more questions about genetically modified food and what it is, be happy to talk about it. GMOs, genetically modified organisms, has been one of the galvanizing issues of the food movement for a while. Back when the organic rules, when the government decided to do a set of rules and do a federal label on organic, they issued a set of draft standards, the USDA, and it was this incredible kind of draft standards that said that food grown with sewage sludge, food grown with genetically modified seeds, and food that was irradiated, all those things could be organic. It was a very kind of, hey, we can all be organic. And probably the USDA felt, I'm sure they were lobbied heavily by Monsanto, who really did think their products were sustainable when they started. They really did, because I've had those arguments with those people. And but most industries want the easiest regulations of all. Right? They want the government to say, yeah, we'll have a pretty low bar. But organic was different. Organic wanted the highest possible bar and had to fight the government to get it. So they went to the public in 2000, I think it was, and did a letter writing campaign. And the USDA got something like I don't know, 450,000 letters. It was more letters than they had ever gotten on any issue. I think it was more letters than the government had gotten on any issue, saying we don't want GM in our organic food, we don't want sewage sludge, which is used as a fertilizer, and we don't want irradiated food. And the government said, okay. And they gave a set of organic standards that were much more to the liking of the organic industry and organic farmers. So GM has been there. It's a galvanizing issue. It's a reason. Concern about GM is one of the reasons that people buy organic food, because right now it's the only place you can be sure that you're not getting GM food. Now, my own experience with this issue, I haven't written about it that much over the years, but I did write a long piece about it in 1998. And that's right after it was introduced. And I had this wonderful opportunity to visit Monsanto, spend time in their labs, pot little GM plants with the woman who was, doing the greenhouse. Got to visit their farms. I was focusing on a potato, and I actually got the genetically modified potatoes and grew them in my garden. So I have grown genetically modified food, and I learned a lot about it. And my takeaways were a couple. One was that that GM wasn't the problem itself, that it was a symptom of the problem, and that monoculture was the bigger problem. And that genetically modified food was just the latest Band-Aid that had come along to allow monocultures to continue. And the reason for this, why I say this, is that the two main genetically modified products are Roundup Ready. This is a set of crops, including corn and soy, but other things as well, that can withstand the herbicide Roundup, a weed killer. So you plant your crops, and then you can spray the hell out of them, and they'll survive. That's really convenient for farmers. Weed control is a tremendous problem. And then the other product, and this is back in '98, is BT crops. These are crops engineered to have their own pesticide. It's a very benign pesticide. It's one used by organic farmers. That's one of the reasons Monsanto thought they were organic. Bacillus thuringiensis is a bacterial toxin. It's in a common soil bacteria, and they taught these plants to exude that toxin in every cell. Problem is, it was in the food part as well as the leaf part and the flower part. And so these were the two big products. The advantage to farmers, because they were very expensive, you have to pay more to buy these products. The advantage to farmers is that you can, with these products, take care of more land. Because if you have a little outbreak of European corn borer, let's say you've got your home 500 acres here, and then you leased another 500 acres 20 miles away, and another 500 acres 30 miles away. If you have a pest outbreak, you may not see it in time to respond and spray. But if your plant is spraying itself essentially every day, you can sleep easy. So basically what GM does for American farmers, the ones who use it, is make it possible to get bigger and bigger and bigger. It makes monocultures grow and keeps them from falling apart for a while. Now it's starting to fail. Both these products are failing. You'll hear about a lot of other GM products, and the industry loves to talk about their drought-tolerant corn and various yield-enhanced versions that are going to feed people in Africa. But really, this is what they've got. This is all they've got, and these are very profitable products, not least because Monsanto also sells the herbicide. So in fact, GM makes money as a way to sell pesticide. The sense in which it is nothing like organic. So that's what the products are. And I can, if you have questions about that, so I think it's a symptom of a larger problem, not the problem itself. The science on it, unclear. When you learn about the kinds of testing that's been done on these products, you would not be reassured. Our government did not say to Monsanto, feed this stuff, and there are other companies too, obviously DuPont, Syngenta, feed this stuff to rats for a couple years and come back and let us know what happens. No, they basically said, test it for allergenicity in a test tube. And there are ways you can see if you get a reaction. And otherwise, the regulatory regime was voluntary, okay? if you want to introduce a new genetically modified food, you fill out a form from the FDA with questions like, are there any reasons to be concerned about safety, yes or no? If you say yes, you then have to go through a consultation process with the FDA. The regulation is kind of nuts. One of the things I learned is I was kind of confused because I thought if you introduce a new ingredient to a food, you have to go through a regulatory FDA process. And we've introduced this new toxin, Bt, into the food supply where it's never been. It's been a pesticide, but it's not been a food. And I asked the FDA, how come they don't have to go through the ingredient regulating process? And the guy there, David Atchison, said, oh, that's easy. It's a pesticide. We can't do anything with pesticides. That's an EPA issue. So I then go to the EPA and I said, I noticed that you've looked at this for and they've decided essentially Bt, not that serious a problem. It's a benign pesticide. I said, but when I buy Bt in a little bottle, which I've done for my garden, there's all these warnings, about what happens if you ingest it, what happens if you get it in your eyes, and how come there's no warning label? And they said, well, that's easy. We can't put labels on food. That's the FDA's job. So it completely falls between the chairs in the regulatory world, which is a problem. I think the biggest problem with GM, or one of the biggest, is it leads to an incredible concentration of power in a handful of companies. And now you have a situation where Monsanto and DuPont control something like 47% of the seeds. This is the basis of life of these seeds, and to have them so narrowly held, I think, is something that we all should worry about. That's a hard issue to sell, though, in a ballot initiative. But I think the important point about GM is that if there were no genetically modified food, the problems of industrial agriculture would not go away. Everything would be kind of status quo ante. So to solve this problem, to win this fight, doesn't necessarily solve, you would still have pretty much the same industrial agriculture, maybe a little bit smaller, maybe a little more diversified sources of seeds, but it wouldn't solve a whole lot of problems. Anyway, so what happens with Prop 37? To me, and I follow food issues, this kind of took me by surprise. This came out of the blue. Suddenly, 1 million signatures or whatever had been put on a petition in California. I didn't really know who was behind it. Subsequently found that it was some of the organic activist groups who had gotten together and gotten some money from a couple people selling supplements and natural food products. And they'd put this on, and then here it was. That was interesting. It wasn't like there was a conversation within the food movement over what issue should we push. Is this the right issue? And then is this the right way to do it? A couple people took it on their own and thought that they would essentially force the issue, that everyone else in the food movement, once the train started leaving the station, would get on board, which is pretty much what happened. But is this the right issue to lead with is a big question. There are other issues that the food movement could push. We heard from Bob Martin about antibiotics, right? This is a really important issue. If you could eliminate antibiotics in livestock production, you would change the factory farming system to some extent. You would have to reduce filth and concentration. There's a really good story you can tell about it. So that's another issue you could push on. What are some others? Animal welfare. Sorry to say, but people care more about animals than just about anything. And the one ballot initiative on food that has succeeded in the last few years is Proposition 2. Anybody remember that? It was just a couple years ago. This was a California ballot initiative very cleverly promoted by the Humane Society of the United States to make it illegal to keep battery hens, laying hens, in cages, small cages. And also to keep sows, female pigs, in these little cages where they couldn't even turn around. And they won that. And not only did they win that, but it then it's on its way to becoming the standard nationally. Corporations are negotiating with the Humane Society to keep it off the ballots in their towns. So other animal welfare issues would be another possibility. And soda taxes and health is another one, which people are working on. So the movement could have gotten together around that. So as far as I know, and I'm not in the inner councils of the food movement or anything, but these questions were not debated. This looked like a winner, though. If you ask the public, 90% of people think that genetically modified food should be labeled. So it sounds like a winner. So anyway, once the train left the station, a lot of people got on board. The Center for Food Safety, which works on GM issues, really good group of litigators. Food Democracy Now!, an Iowa-based group who are really good organizers. You should get on their email list if you're not. Environmental Working Group, Ken Cook, who was here talking about Farm Bill reform. He ended up playing a role. He got in kind of late, though. Dan Imhoff was very involved. He was here on that Farm Bill panel. Just Label It campaign, a national GM labeling organization founded by Gary Hirschberg of Stonyfield Farm. Food and Water Watch, some natural food grocers and manufacturers. And I think people said if a big victory was achieved here on this seemingly popular issue, it would, as I wrote in my piece, it would be a very helpful thing to have a victory we could point to. And that's why I wrote that piece. Which I might have written a little differently now. But a big victory would help across the board. So, you know, I was, as I said, I'm not privy to the interior workings, but there were certain kind of circular firing squad aspects to the people involved. There was fighting internally. There were people getting tossed off the steering committee, people coming back on. And there were a lot of tensions. I think as a result of that, the messaging was not always as clear as it should have been. You had different groups putting out different videos on different, you know, hitting different issues. I think it took them a while to really find their place in terms of messaging. It wasn't discipline, let's say. But before I offer my criticisms of the campaign, I think it's important to point out that even the most brilliantly run campaign on this issue might well have lost. The industry spent $46 million to defeat this, okay? That's a lot of money. There are very few Senate campaigns that cost $46 million. And they were willing to spend more if they had to. Monsanto had somehow succeeded in getting all the grocery manufacturers to feel that this was their issue too. And that wasn't necessarily the case. And that they all kicked in, Kellogg, Unilever, General Mills. And it was an awful lot of money. And even at the beginning, people in the campaign said, we've got to raise $10 million to defeat this. And had they raised $10 million, they might well have defeated this. And I'll offer just one bit of evidence to support that. And that is that I understand from a lawyer who worked on the campaign that of people who voted on Election Day, last Tuesday, the measure won. Now, what's different with those people than the people who did early voting? The main thing is that the advertising of the no campaign was not responded to for weeks and weeks because they didn't have the money. The last several days, they put up some ads. They put up some really good ads. And they were I don't know if you saw them, but they were these kind of gauzy family, right to know, food is important to us, you know, transparency. It was actually the most conservative message of all the messages they played with. And it was clearly the most effective. People who saw those ads voted for it. A lot of them did. So that does suggest that with a few more $1 million, this could have been turned. I don't know. But that said, one of the big issues in this campaign was about the science. In the middle of the campaign, an event takes place. A French scientist named Seralini, who had done a long-term feeding study of glyphosate, Roundup, and genetically modified Roundup-ready corn, I think, or soy, and he announced his findings. And everybody in the campaign was really excited about this. I was tipped off, be on this press conference. This is a game changer. And I kept hearing, this is a game changer. I tuned in, and there's this French scientist who sounds a lot more like a political activist than a scientist. It's a different scientific culture there, I guess. And he is, the story is rolled out in really a kind of bad way and a very ideological way. And meanwhile, everybody dumped on this guy. And I would say unfairly in some ways, but he was so dumped on by the mainstream press that the critique of his methods was in the lead of the articles. Usually they wait till the second paragraph, but it was in the lead. And I'm sure a lot of Monsanto-funded people were jumping all over him. But the campaign had kind of promoted this, and it was not a smart thing to promote, in my view. I don't think you win this campaign on the scientific merits. And the reason I say that is not that there isn't a scientific case to be made about genetically modified food. It hasn't yet been made to anyone's satisfaction, except a handful of activists. But I don't even think that's the ground you want to fight on, because as soon as you do, and now I'm speaking as a journalist and former editor, the media tends to give much more credence to mainstream science, to the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or the National Research Council, both of whom have said GM food is fine. Put them up against a fringy French scientist, you're not going to win, and you're going to lose the media. And one of the things that happened in this fight, and this isn't the only reason it happened, was the campaign lost the editorial boards of most of the newspapers in the state. I think that was really devastating. You know, if the food movement has one friend in this world, it's the media, right? The media has been very friendly to the food movement for the most part. Why didn't they get on board? Well, there are a couple reasons. Again, I wasn't privy to these meetings, but presumably the campaign got to present their case. I don't know what they stressed. If you're talking to journalists, you want to talk about right to know and transparency. These are values that journalists agree on, and in fact, most of the public agrees on, and they're impossible to argue with. You don't talk about questionable science, I think. And I don't know if they did or not, but I'm saying that was very much in the air. There were other problems too, though. The Legislative Affairs Office that writes about the impact of these measures had said that it was going to be there was going to be a lot of litigation around it, and that would hurt retailers and possibly farmers. That wasn't very good information, and we don't know how that got in there, but that hurt also. This idea that it was like Prop 65, which, you know, you see those signs warning you about that the state of California has found this airplane, this bus, this everything is going to cause cancer. And there was a lot of litigation around that. And a lot of people assumed that was true here, even though it wasn't. Now, I just want to take a moment to talk about the arguments and what was deceptive about it. Because I do believe that the arguments for that the no on 37 we're putting out, that all of you have seen, were really deceptive. And I'll just give you a couple examples. I mean, the first one was it's going to increase your food bill, $1.4 billion, $400 a person. You know, this was just people pulling numbers out of a hat. It was a PR firm in Maine came up with that study, and very little to back it up. And no one could even understand the logic of how it would cost that much to put a little label on some food. So there was that. The other was that there were all these special exemptions, and that remember they showed the picture of this can of dog food must be labeled. This pound of chopped meat doesn't have to be labeled. Crazy, isn't it? Well, okay. No, it's not crazy, actually. Here's how that came about. They did not require meat or milk to be labeled unless the animal that you were eating was genetically modified. If the feed that the animal was eating was genetically modified, you didn't have to label the food. In this, they were following the rules in Europe. And indeed, they were generally trying to harmonize the rules with what had already been established in other countries. And the European Union has labels. So what about the dog food? Well, that's full of grain. There's very little meat in dog food. It's grain. And if the grain is genetically modified, you have to label it. There are many other examples like that. Oh, you don't have to label alcohol. You know, whose exemption is that? Well, there's no ingredient labeling on any alcohol. Have you ever noticed that when you buy a beer? No ingredient label. That's part of, I don't know why we have that, but this would be the, except in Germany, right? They have their purity laws, their 5 ingredients or whatever it is. But so it would be weird if that was the only ingredient that got mentioned on beer. And the same is true with restaurant food and hospital food. Do you see ingredient labels on restaurant food and hospital? No. So they exempted that. But the point is, when you want to defeat a ballot measure, that's one of the classic moves, is that it's written in a shady way and somebody's winning and it's not you. And then the other is it's going to raise money. And so they had a very effective campaign. These are really well-tested ideas. And if you can create doubt in people's minds about a ballot initiative, you go no, if you have any doubt at all. And indeed, that's another problem with the editorial boards, I think. The media's basic attitude on initiatives is if there's any question in their minds, they say no. That's the default. So anyway, they didn't get to their 10 million goal. They got to 6 or 7, although a lot of their money was spent gathering signatures. And the other side, as I said, 46 million. But, you know, this issue of fear and science, I think is an important one for the food movement to think about. I mean, if that's the basis of your appeal, is that you're scaring people about genetically modified food, I don't think it's very good ground to stand on. And I think it can come back to bite you. The fact is, you should be arguing for more science. You know, the answer to bad science is more science. The fact is, it's very hard to study these products. One of the really horrible things about the way they're regulated is that Monsanto, when you buy seeds, you sign a contract saying you will not perform any academic research on those seeds or the crops that they produce without Monsanto's express permission and their right of prior review of your science. That's the story I tell, that we can't do the science. Again, information, freedom of information, I think, is the best ground to stand on. And transparency in general is a great umbrella concept, I think, for the food movement. That so much of this movement is about telling you where your food comes from and how it was produced. And I think that should be across the board as something that the food movement pushes. Now, I wrote before the election that Prop 37 would be a test of, quote, and you read this piece, whether there is a food movement worthy of the name. That is, an organized force in our politics capable of demanding changes in the food system. I went out on a limb. What can I say? Because I thought it did have that potential. The obverse, though, I don't think is necessarily true, that the loss of this means we don't have a food movement and that we don't have a political force out there. And I don't agree with the Center for Consumer Freedom. Do you know who those guys are? Talk about euphemism. This is a corporate lobby paid for by the restaurant and food manufacturers. They took this vote as proof that there is no food movement outside of Berkeley and the Upper West Side. So I don't think that that's true. I think I will reiterate what I said. I think that the food movement is very young. I think it's still disorganized in many, many ways. I think that it awaits a generation of leaders that I hope some of whom are in this room. And people who are, good political fighters and good political messengers. And we need to get better at it, basically. The fact is, more than 4.3 million people voted for this. That's a lot of votes on a food issue. It just so happens that 4.7 voted against it. So more work needs to be done. I think we have to ask our question, could the 6 million we raised have been better spent in Sacramento on a law? Now that there's a supermajority, maybe. It's a very expensive state to fight a ballot initiative in. There are 8 major media markets. It costs a fortune to fight these battles here. But if the food movement lost this fight, what exactly did Monsanto and its allies win? I think we have to ask that question too. And I would argue very little. They didn't win the argument because they didn't enter the debate. They never talked about genetically modified food. Not once in their ads did they use the words genetically modified food. They said a deceptive labeling scheme. They were afraid to mention those words because when they mention those words, they lose. So it's not as if they came out and defended what they were doing against the critics and won. They basically, and Ken Cook, who was here, put it this way. They won a savagely run campaign on technicalities, not the underlying principle. And I think that there is a lot of truth to that. So they can't go back and say they have created more of a public for genetically modified food. What they have proven is their sheer money and power. And then the other person you've got, or other interest you have to think about is, what about all these food companies that got into bed with Monsanto on this? How are they feeling now? How do they feel about the $4 million that, I don't know how much Kellogg spent, or General Mills? What did they get for that money? They really get no benefit from genetically modified food, selling it. They only get a risk, the risk of a PR backlash. And here they are, out in public, arguing for lack of transparency. And they're seeing that 4.7 million of their customers and potential customers want this information. My guess is the food industry takes a good hard look at this and thinks, we don't want to fight this one again, not this way. I think it's possible to separate the food industry from the chemical companies and seed companies, and that should be a really important focus. Whether it's done with boycotts or just letting people know where these food companies were. This happened once before. The potato I was telling you about, the new leaf potato, very interesting story. Those are not on the market anymore. What happened? This is one of Monsanto's proudest products when they started. Well, there was some press about it. And writers, myself included, said, this is 98, do you think you've ever eaten genetically modified food? Well, if you've been to McDonald's, you have. If you've eaten a Frito-Lay product, you have. And as that meme got out there, people started writing letters to McDonald's and Frito-Lay saying, is it true that you're selling genetically modified potatoes? And I don't know how many letters there were, but it was probably just hundreds. But they were disorganized letters. They weren't a campaign. And those companies took a look at the question, what do we get from selling genetically modified French fries as opposed to conventional? What do we get from selling genetically modified potato chips? And both companies very quietly let the farmers know, we don't want any more genetically modified potatoes. And within months, Monsanto dropped that product. So that wedge is there to be driven. And I don't even think it's that hard to drive. So for people who are interested in working on that, I would suggest that's something to think about. But I think we should also think, is this the right issue to push right now? The movement needs to have a conversation about its priorities. And I don't have answers to that. I have questions. One is, should the movement be working to develop a large membership organization, a la the Sierra Club, that would give it another source of revenue? Does it need a steering committee, of a handful of people, as the environmental movement has? There's a group of presidents of environmental organizations that get together and try to coordinate things. Should we be working on Congress or localities, boycotts or elections, frontal attacks or something a little more indirect? Look at what works. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which you'll hear, I think, about next week, has been very successful with targeted boycotts of various companies to get raises for the tomato pickers in California. Divestment. This is where the climate movement is heading right now. Should we be working on divestment, getting our universities to divest from the companies that are the bad actors in food? All these questions are out there and need to be addressed. Should we be stressing public health issues or environmental issues or agricultural policy? Or should we stress the issues that help with the soft politics I addressed at the beginning? I think those politics are really important. I often get attacked for saying, voting with your fork, that's not real politics. I don't agree. I think it is real politics. It may not be everything we need to do, but by building these alternative economic and social arrangements, by finding a new kind of relationship with the people who are feeding us, a lot happens. A lot happens psychologically. We do learn other ways of being in this economy. I think a lot of what draws people to the food movement is the pleasure, the communitarian pleasure of joining those communities that are forming around food, that are forming around cooking, that are forming around the farmer's market. A lot of the food movement is a protest against our consumerist, capitalistic system and people looking for other kinds of relationships with their dollars. I don't think that that's a trivial thing. If you ask people, and I often do this, how would you feel if there were organic Coca-Cola next year? Coca-Cola announces, we're doing organic Coca-Cola. Or that McDonald's is going organic. You know, this would be great from an environmental point of view, right? I mean, think of all the acres of cornfield that no longer will be sprayed with atrazine. Yet, it doesn't make people feel that good. It's kind of not what they want, or not what everybody wants. I actually think those would be good things. But I notice audiences are often disappointed with that. They're looking for something else. And what appeals to them about the food movement is this effort to carve out a space that's not as commercialized, that's not as based on greed and self-interest, that is like a civil society space. You know, I take a lot of inspiration from the leaders in 1989 in Czechoslovakia and Poland, people like Václav Havel and Adam Michnik. And they had this wild idea. They were living in this, crushing Soviet bloc existence. Very little space for politics. Very little space for anything. And they simply made a leap of faith that they could act as if they lived in a free country. And they organized their daily lives, their daily practice around that idea. And the space got bigger and bigger and bigger, and more people joined it. I think what's drawing people to the food movement in part is this pleasure people have, and pleasure is a very important component of the food movement, in creating a civil society space, not against government intrusion, as was the case in Eastern Europe, but against corporate intrusion in our lives. And that people want to create a realm that is free of that. That's a very powerful thing, because I think it leads to politics. And if it didn't happen this time, the bigger that space gets, the more people who take pleasure in inhabiting that space, and the more we can democratize that space, it'll happen eventually. Thank you. So, thank you. Anyway, that's my take. I'd love to hear your questions. And I raced over a lot of stuff. And so I'm happy to elaborate or extend or whatever you like. I want to take questions from students first. Student? Okay. Yeah, could you maybe stand up and speak as loud as you can? Sorry. On Prop 37. Yeah, I got the same email. Did anyone else get that? There's a petition going around because there are something like 1.6 million, 2 million uncounted ballots in California. A lot of them in Los Angeles. And the petition is to demand that they be counted. The question becomes, would this change the outcome? And from what I've been able to learn, talking to smarter political minds than myself, is that given where these ballots are, it probably wouldn't change the proportions. In other words, they're in counties where either no prevailed or it was really close. It's not like they're pockets. It's not like Berkeley is uncounted. If Berkeley had been uncounted, it would be something to... but, there's no reason not to count those ballots and see what the final number is. The total will go up. It will turn out to be more than 4.3 million people who voted for this thing. Yes?
Can you talk about the soda tax?
Yeah, the soda tax, another issue. A much more devastating loss. There was a Measure N in Richmond to put a tax on soda. I think it was a penny per ounce. There have been soda taxes all over the country over the last couple years. They've all been defeated. Big Soda has spent, I've heard, ranging from 50 million to 220 million total to defeat these things. They're terrified that one of these will pass, because when it does, the basic idea of a soda tax is you collect all this money, and it's a lot of money, and you use it to fund anti-obesity, anti-diabetes efforts, and put it into public health. And they've lost in many places. Actually, there's another one somewhere else in California that also lost. The industry spent, are any of the students working on this issue in the room? Something like $3 million to defeat it, up against $7,000 or something like that. I mean, it's really lopsided. But it was a pretty ugly campaign. It got pretty racial in its composition. And basically, the soda company was funding a populist message against some local public health people who, from what I see, didn't, it's pretty easy to see it as a paternalistic tax. And the soda industry exploited that really well. But they also hired a ton of people. It was the best jobs program that Richmond has ever seen. And what I think should grow out of this is every underserved community in America needs to put a soda tax on the ballot next fall. And there will be this, flood. I mean, what's going on with the food industry, and this is true of Monsanto too, is this game of what I said in that piece you read, whack-a-mole. These things are popping up everywhere, and they're having to spend a lot of money to knock them down. So maybe a strategy is bring them up everywhere, like mushrooms, and let the industry. That's the real soda tax, right? Get the industry to pay people to hand out leaflets for a couple months. Anyway, the people who work on that issue, Kelly Brownell, I talked to him about it. He said one of these is going to pass eventually. I think doing it in a small municipality is probably a bad idea, because you do have this unfairness where the little mom and pop grocery stores selling soda here have to charge a different price than people right across the street. It should be statewide. It would raise, I think Kelly said this, $1.1 billion a year for California if there were a soda tax nationally. But it's an issue that churns up a lot of bad feelings, as people in Richmond learned. Organic.
Supporting organic non-GMO products. I know there's some obvious answer here, but could you explain sort of the argumentation that was provided by the companies?
Yeah. Well, I wasn't privy to that conversation. I think the interesting conversation, and Ken Cook actually has a lobbyist he hired away from the Grocery Manufacturers Association, who I'm really eager to talk to, because he probably knows exactly how Monsanto persuaded all these companies that they were in the same boat. Probably they said there'd be huge disruptions in the supply lines, because all the corn and all the soy is GM. And it'd be very hard to get enough GM to reformulate your products. The assumption, by the way, though, is interesting, that if this thing passes, and someone at the grocery manufacturer said this to the New York Times, if this thing passes, what will be the response? Do you slap the label on, may contain genetically modified ingredients? And everybody in grocery manufacturers said, no, we reformulate without them. That probably, because they think that label does not sell food. And they're probably right. And in Europe, there's very little genetically modified, where there is labeling. By the way, there's labeling in 61 other countries, okay? Every industrialized country, and a few not, have labeling, okay? This isn't a fringy idea by any means. But in those countries, sales of genetically modified crops, commodities like that, go way down. So probably they said, this is just going to be a mess for you to reformulate. Now, within a year, farmers would start growing alternatives, but there would be the challenge of segregating it and having a non-GMO, strain of corn. I talked to a farmer in Indiana who was in favor of labeling, and he said that Now he can get a premium for non-GM corn of about 5 or 10%. So maybe, that would grow. There would be demand for non-GM corn, and the price would go up for a while. But the market, people could change what they're planting within a year. It's not like going to organic conversion or anything that takes 3 years. So then you have all these companies in the food industry that own organic companies. And that was a challenge for raising money, because Kashi, I think, is owned by Kellogg's, and Cascadian Farms is owned by General Mills. So these stalwarts of the organic industry that might have been there helping with this fight are now in the belly of the beast, and they're not available to help. And so that is one of the downsides when big food decides to get into organic, is that they kind of neuter the political side of these companies. Yes?
You said that a lot of change happens because of people's fear, like in the case of the apples. But then when we discussed Prop 37, you said that we shouldn't focus on the mice, and these mice had, tumors as big as themselves, and they were fed on BT corn. So, within the campaign, and a lot of the volunteers were thinking maybe we should have focused on the fact that GM foods are dangerous, and maybe we would have gotten more attention from the people who actually didn't know anything about GM foods before.
Well, I mean, the argument is, should there have been more focus on fear and the dangers of these crops? Maybe it would have worked. I mean, I understand from the focus groups that the more conservative ads that the campaign ended up running were the most effective when they showed them to people. I think that pushing too hard on that study, I saw the same pictures of rats with tumors. And when I said that there was something unfair about the attack on this study, the important thing to know is this study, by the judgment of a lot of scientists I respect, was not adequate in terms of the number of animals, in terms of the protocols. However, the scientist was actually using the exact same protocols, same kind of rats, as Monsanto used to get the products approved in Europe. Europe did ask for rat studies. He was just extending them longer, and the animals got sick. So, if the science was lousy and not a good enough reason to not eat GM food, why was it a good enough reason to eat GM food just a year or two ago? And I think that's where not enough attention was paid to that idea, that the scientists would say, all right, I'm going to take the same studies that Monsanto did to get this stuff approved, and I'm just going to extend it out, the full lifespan of these animals. I think we need more and better science. I just don't think it's there yet. I mean, I think the argument coming out of this should be, wow, we need to study this. We need to do it right. The NSF or National Institute of Medicine or somebody needs to put a lot of money into a big study. You can't do it in America, though, because of the rules about the seeds. So you've got to first force Monsanto to relent and let you study their seeds. So I don't know that it would have worked. I think it would have been countered, and in the face of scientific confusion and arguing scientists back and forth, and you would have had some very prominent scientists and scientific organizations against you, most people would have said, well, I can't sort out the science, so I'm going to vote no. Because that, again, is the default. If you can't have a clear... whereas, you see, the right to know, transparency, there's no argument against it. No one is for opacity out there, right? And you can't make a politics defending opacity for the long term. But we just differ on that opinion. Yes?
I have a question about the fact that, GMOs are labeled in 61 countries. Do you have any ideas as to why states
Yeah.
can't get this stuff labeled?
Well, you have to go back to the history. And genetically modified food was regulated in 1992. The rules were written. They were designed by Dan Quayle. Remember Dan Quayle? As part of, what, you could, end of story? No, it's not quite the end of story. He was doing a whole deregulatory. Remember, we had a very sluggish economy in the early 90s, in the first Bush administration. And so he was given the job of regulating this under the rubric of don't regulate this. Do as little as possible. He oversaw this process at the FDA. The FDA ruled that genetically modified food is substantially equivalent to the conventional food it replaces. This sounds like a scientific judgment. It really wasn't. It was an assertion. Many scientists at the FDA, we learned later, didn't agree. They said we should take a harder look at it. Because it was substantially equivalent, they said that it didn't need to be labeled. And that's what happened. Now, that wouldn't have been the end of the story if we had a Democratic Party that wasn't also tied closely to Monsanto. Monsanto is a very clever company, and in fact, it's a Democratic company. I mean, to the extent you can say certain companies support one party and not the other. Monsanto's been very close to the Democratic Party, very close to President Clinton. And in fact, the president of Monsanto, Robert Shapiro, served on various boards, in the White House. And the reason for that history, besides, shoveling money at the Democrats, was we had something called industrial policy. This was the Democrats' big idea for digging our way out of recession in 1992 in that election. The idea is that we pick some winner industries like Silicon Valley, like biotechnology, a couple others, and the government supports them with everything they can. Biotech looked like the shiny new great industry. And so the Democrats got very much behind biotech. So you got the Republicans who love Monsanto because of deregulation, and you got the Democrats who love them because they're the future and they're going to generate all these jobs. And in America, when you have both political parties agreeing on something, and we just saw this in the third debate about drones. Do you remember how long that conversation lasted? Boom, it was over. You don't get politics. Politics disappear. Politics in America only happens really, there's movement politics on the side, but politics that shows up in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, takes place between the leadership of the two parties and nowhere else. And that's why we didn't have a debate. Other countries had a huge debate. And in fact, the reason I wrote that piece in '98, and if you want to see it, you can download it on my website, which you have on your syllabus, michaelpollan.com. It's called Playing God in the Garden, I think it was called. Where was I going? So in Europe, they were going nuts. They were burning GM fields. They were, pulling them out. There were public actions, and even people in government were saying this Monsanto stuff we shouldn't allow on our shores. And what inspired that article was like, wait a minute, either they're crazy for having this debate about this perfectly safe technology, or we're crazy for not having a debate about it. And I concluded we were crazy not to have a debate about it. But that's what I learned about American politics. You need some space between the two parties. And on this issue, we haven't had it. Dennis Kucinich was the only person in Congress. Every year, he would put a labeling bill in. And I don't think he ever got up above like 12 co-sponsors in the House. The Democrats didn't want to touch it either. Okay, I think we have time for one more. Yeah?
Looking forward, do you have anything to say about Washington's initiative campaign, I-522, to label GMOs in their state?
Yeah, there's another campaign up in Washington. I don't know that much about it. I think Washington is fertile territory. And the reason for that is that the two big crops who don't have genetically modified products are wheat, which is very big there, and rice. And the reason they don't is that the farmers don't want them because they don't want to lose their market in Europe and in Asia. So I think there you might, if everybody plays their politics right, you might be able to get the farmers on your side, which would help a lot. But beyond that, I think it's something you should watch. You have one more question? Yeah.
Question, and perhaps your answer can help me understand why other organizations like Food and Water Watch did this way as well. Why did you wait until the 11th hour to make a stand or say anything about Prop 37?
Why did I wait till the 11th hour to make a stand or say anything about Prop 37?
Stand but say anything about it?
Well, I published this piece, which was the first week in October. It was as fast as I could get it out. I don't write that fast. As soon as I learned about it,
Like, what was it?
oh, I didn't even know about it back then. No. I mean, no. I mean, I'm a journalist, and I write pieces when I can sell pieces, and I can convince an editor that the time is right. It's not like I get to stand up and say, I want the front page of the New York Times and take a position. I wish it were that easy. But the Times had their food issue, and their food issue was on October 13th or whatever it was, and I said I want to write about this, and that's why I did. I actually didn't learn about it till over the summer, believe it or not. So that was, you know, somebody should have reached out to me. I did. You did? All right, we'll talk about it later. Anyway, thank you for your great questions. We'll see you next week.